We are back again from the commercial break and the words from our sponsors. I hope you enjoyed spending time with Magnum, the private investigator and COGS correspondent. It seems he had his hands full with the passionate people of the city. I'm glad the public is taking such interest.
It isn't the general public that is taking interest. You might recall that those people were already knowledgeable on these issues because they have a professional stake in globalization and how it is managed.
Alright, I'll give you that. Let's bring this conversation full circle. Coming onto this show today, you knew we would be taking an in-depth look at managing globalization from the neoliberal perspective. What would be your initial comments thus far?
Absolutely fabulous. After 25 years of managing globalization and guiding states into strong economic development, I'm ready to talk with your producers to come back again and celebrate our 50th anniversary on your show, Mr. Skeptic.
Getting a bit ahead again, Ms. Neoliberal? Here's how we are going to wrap up this show. I'm going to ask you a question and your answer will be judged by our audience who has been following along with the show and becoming familiar with our talking points. The more applause you receive, the better you are doing, but the more boos you receive, the worse you are doing. Makes sense so far?
Like a slice of GDP pie.
Okay. At the end of the show, we'll tally the questions by your audience feedback and determine if your management style of neoliberalism has been the right choice for managing globalization. Shall we begin?
Ready when you are, Mr. Skeptic.
Right. Democracy is very important not only to our beloved United States, but to most nations of the world. As we continue to interlink with other nations, some of whom are not practicing democracies, assume that some are in name, but not by function. How would you say that democracy is promoted with a neoliberal agenda?
Great first question. Of course, democracy is expanded through neoliberalism. One of our cornerstones is liberalization, which ensures complete freedom of ideas to flow back and forth between all parties. Democracy plays a significant role in the formation of our institutions and policy making. We will eventually trade with non-democratic nations, and when they see how our governing bodies protect the people and their rights to develop, they will see the light that is democracy.
Wow. I don't think I've heard anything so brazen and centrist in a long time. I can agree with you halfway. Your efforts to help spread democracy through liberalization, but I think other nations, even other democratic nations, see our institutional governance as a joke. Times are changing, but for now much of the developed world, particularly the Northern Hemisphere, still treats management of economic development as a boys' club, if you'll excuse my gentrification. When the backroom arm bending and political maneuvering take a backseat and allow true democracy to occur, then perhaps you will be right. Still, the nations that should lead this charge to the moral high ground are often the ones guilty of standing in the way. Moving along now. Expanding from the first question, do you believe there is more than one form of capitalism or democracy, and if so, are we in competition with other capitalist democratic states? By competition, I mean the exporting of ideas.
Brilliant. Yes, there are several forms of democracy and capitalism. We're in competition for certain. Competition exists for everything in life, or have you not been paying attention to my call for? This is not as easy to detect as, say, competition for a utility service or a television set. However, states engage in this form of competition through a practice known as first mover advantage. It encourages a developed country to take a developing nation under its wing and help to shape its growth. The first mover nation uses this early development time to create a compliant trade partner and instill similar political, economic, and if possible cultural or social values. This differs from imperialism, as the developed nation does not force itself upon the developing nation. This form of aid is not mandatory. We see this type of aid practiced by China and the European Union today among many African nations.
The audience seems pleased with that reply. I, however, disagree with your feelings of what is mandatory. Larger nations have their ways of tipping the scales of choice in their favor far too often. Moving on. The gross domestic product, or GDP, is the most widely used metric to evaluate domestic growth. Do you agree?
Yes. My 4 principles are designed to maximize our output potential and become perfectly competitive. I realize some nations at a hint of realism to temper our eager methods, but for the most part we seek to grow our GDP to its fullest potential. We can then compare our GDP with others to see who is on top. It's worked for years and should still work for years to come.
It would seem the audience disagrees with you, Ms. Neoliberal. Perhaps they would have been sated if you told them it does not adequately serve as a metric for economic research. It looks at market sums, but does not account for investments. Looking solely at GDP also skews our perception of the personal purchasing parity, which helps understand the buying power of the consumers and accounts for currency rates and market fluctuations, as well as the gross national income, which accounts for the income a company receives for its operations outside of the US. MNCs tends to twist their accounting figures with gross domestic figures by lumping their sums various sources of income together. Instead of GDP, states could also the World Giving Index, the United States Census Bureau data, the United Nations Development Fund, and so on. Let's continue with one last multi-part question. Do we need to reform global rules? Should we introduce new rules, encourage non-rule based accountability for MNCs, or?
You do realize you just asked me a loaded question, right?
Really? How so? I'm only looking at the world's current condition and asking questions framed from possible solutions.
You know that I'm neoliberalism. To admit that we need a full reform of our public policies is to admit mismanagement, just like when a company changes CEOs when they screw up the job. If I disagree with the portion on reforming the global rules, then I am accepting the full responsibility for the current crises as a natural part of our plan for better or worse, and I appear as the villain. Either way, you are holding my feet to the fire. Lastly, you are asking me to even consider implementing any sort of protectionist measures. Are you right in the head, sir? I am neoliberalism in the purest sense. I will not tolerate such nonsense as protectionism, be it tariffs, or through non-tariffs like subsidies. Trade must be free to flow unimpeded.
It seems you are neglecting to answer the question. You are being dodgy.
It is an unfair question. It's a trick.
It is no more a trick question than if I was to ask you what you like to read. So do you support reforming global rules and protectionist measures, even in limited quantity?
No.
Then I'm truly sorry, Ms. Neoliberal, but I believe that both the audience and I both agree that you are not properly suited to be the CEO of Globocorp and leader for Managing Globalization. You are simply too inflexible to meet the needs of the world and care for its people. You should have at least considered a tiered system of protectionism to shelter emerging states and their industries.
It was a stupid idea to come. You tricked me.
Have a great day and thank you for coming, Ms. Neoliberal. Next time we should do a split session with you and your old pals Marxism and Realism and the Good Times roll.